I recently published my first miniatures game called Contact Xenos, and I published that having zero experience in publishing or graphic design. Basically, I've always created rule sets and add-ons for other games, like this YouTube channel has a fair amount of homebrew content for Warhammer-style games and Kill Team. And I've read every book my library has and watched every video I could find on game design theory, but I never found anything that went from stage 1 of having an idea to having that game fully published where people could actually play it. Normally they were only theory, like what makes a game fun, or they were only how to talk to publishers, kind of like the business side of it, not the whole process. I also think a lot of people want to hold on to the air quotes secrets of how to do it to lower competition, which I think is insane. Like, if I make enough money off this game itself to buy some more miniatures, I'll be happy. I just thought the process was really fun, and that's the main reason I did it, and I wanted to share it so other people can try it out too. So in this video, I want to go step by step, getting really gritty into the process to show you how to actually make your own game. I think one of the first questions that most people would want to know is the cost. So for each stage here, I'll try to explain what your options are in more detail, but this really is a it depends situation. So to be transparent, I spent about $300 all in, just so you know what I did. But I'll dive more into that as the video goes. It can vary a lot. I just hate when you get a really roundabout answers in videos like this, so I wanted to lead off with my experience. So we're focusing on a few $100 option, but I will tell you ways to reduce or increase that. I personally wanted to go affordable without sacrificing too much quality. So the first step is the one that has the least technical aspect to it, and that is generating the actual idea for a game. So this video will work for anything that's basically a miniatures game, but especially a small scale like Skirmish one. Or it will work for any RPG style game, think like Dungeons & Dragons. So for mine, I went with a miniature agnostic Skirmish game. How I did this is I started with a mechanic I thought was really interesting. So I was playing a lot of Hades, the video game, which is a roguelike game, meaning that your encounters and your upgrades are random throughout the game. So you have to just pick whatever upgrade synergizes most with what you're doing and adjust on the fly. And you don't spend much time leveling or character building, so you can just launch a game, play a run, and then stop if you win or lose. It's very casual. For the game type, I thought this roguelike mechanic would lend itself to a miniature skirmish game, where you have a relatively small amount of models to apply these random upgrades to. In a big war game, it wouldn't work as well, and I knew miniature wargaming better than big army wargaming anyways, and I'll cover this later, but my channel is mostly Kill Team players, so I knew there'd be a market for a skirmish game for people I could actually talk to. So now I have the main mechanic I want to go off of, a style of game, and now I have to pick out a genre or a vibe. So another video game I was playing at the time was Aliens Fireteam Elite. I really liked the small group with different classes running through a horde of xenomorphs, so that's the general genre I went with. Like, if you buy my game, you can tell the lore is very alien inspired. So there are two things I want to cover when it comes to the actual idea concept. The first is that you don't have to go crazy with your mechanics being super unique. Honestly, if you want to take a rough idea and just apply a new genre to it, that can work really well. So this is a big overgeneralization, but Starfinder is a very, very successful game. But I'm guessing the original idea was, man, I love Pathfinder. I wish we could play it in a sci-fi setting. The trick is that they didn't carry it over one-to-one. They took the general concept of Pathfinder in space, and they completely redid the details to make it make sense. And they make sure all the ideas actually fit sci-fi, and they didn't just reskin the base game. So like the main benefit here is you know the base idea is a really fun concept. You just have to take that really fun concept and build it up in a new way. The other thing I want to cover is the uniqueness of the idea. It's the whole concept that every story has already been written, and we can simply do it better, or in this case, make it our own. I have no problem admitting the general universe of my game is inspired by Ridley Scott's Alien. When you read that first paragraph of lore, you can see that influence. But then it very quickly becomes its own thing. Like, there's over 40 species of aliens you can encounter, and they're all vastly different from each other. And you would see mechanisms in this game that are similar to other games you've played. But once you start playing all of it, like the way I put it all together, it's a new, original experience. Like, I promise you, if you make like a fantasy miniatures game, someone else will immediately compare it to something else like Lord of the Rings, The Witcher, or Age of Sigmar, or Warcry. Don't let that bother you as long as the overall experience feels creative and new. So the final note here is don't get married to an idea. I've had a few different ideas that just didn't work out. I've had probably 5 or so before this one, and at some point in the playtesting, I decided to bench it and go to something else entirely. So at any point, don't be afraid to take your notes and keep them so you can come back to them, but start working on something else instead. So now that you have the general idea of what you're making, let's talk about it more technically. At some point, you'll want people to actually play your game, and if you're not doing electronic only, you'll have to have it published or printed. So I want to go over a couple different methods and give you the pros and cons of each. And we'll do the method I'm personally using last. The reason I want to talk about this part now, even though it would technically come later, is it really limits what you can do while you're actually making your game. If you know you're going to use a publisher, then having a million little trackers and tokens and board pieces won't really matter as much. But if you're doing it fully self-published and everything's coming out of pocket, your budget matters a lot more. And if you're thinking about doing something like print on demand, then you're limited by what that company offers. So I think picking out your publisher method here is important, so you don't design things that are outside of the scope of what you can do based on your actual method you're using. So the first method is the one that most people probably default to, and it's getting a publisher to make your game. This is where you find a company to take your game concept and rules, do mostly layout work and the graphic design. They have any legal work that needs done, marketing, financing, like adding in art, and then they actually sell your games to distributors and to the public. If they do, you'll be paid a small royalty for each copy they sell. It might legitimately be less than $1, but the idea is that they will hopefully sell a lot more of them, and they've done most of the work for you. There are a lot of pros to working with a game company like this. The first is that so much of the work is done for you, and it will be done professionally. Like the artwork in your game will be done by a professional artist, and if there's miniatures, they'll be sculpted and printed by a professional. You also have no logistics you have to worry about. So this may end up being the method that actually ends up with the best product at the end of the day. This method will have some of the lowest cost of entry, and you don't have to calculate profits or cost or budget or anything like that. So financially, it's going to be pretty simple. Basically, you sell them an idea and they finalize it. You've really only had to spend money on getting your playtesting done and some semi-professional looking note cards and tokens to pitch it to the actual company. You could only have $50 in a prototype and get your game published this way. That's way cheaper than any other method. So the biggest con to this is it's very difficult to actually do. Like, out of all of them, this one has the highest difficulty of it actually happening. And that's because the publisher has to agree to it. A lot of them don't actually take open submissions, and some of them you have to pitch to them at an actual gaming convention where they're hearing hundreds of submissions and getting emails weekly. So you can get stuck having a game that you think is ready and you think it's awesome, but no one wants to buy it from you. And at least in this space, there's not a ton of companies that take ideas and do RPGs or wargames. There's a few, but it's pretty rare. A lot of them just do their own ideas in-house. This method of using a publisher is a lot more common for board games or card games, like kind of the stuff you see at Walmart, not so much in the actual wargame space. Another con is if they do take your game, you lose control of it. If you're a creative and you have a vision, it might not happen the way you want it to. Like, if you're picturing things a certain way, they can just change it. They can even change your rules significantly, so it doesn't even really end up looking like your original game all that much. There's also a chance that they buy your game and just never do anything with it. Typically, you can get a clause in your contract that you'll get some money just for selling them the rights if they don't publish it within a certain time window, but I'm sure that's still frustrating even if you get like $1,000 for it. That you had this idea, went through all the work, and just nothing ever happened with it. So next up we have full self-publishing. This is going to be the method where you have complete and total control of everything, and you keep almost all of the profit from your sales this way. So it's the total opposite of using a publisher. In this method, you'll do all the work to actually make your game, from the ideas and the prototyping and the playtesting, like getting your rules actually ready to play. But then this is where full self-publishing becomes more difficult, because you have to take those rules, format them into a book, and then find a printer, have them printed, and then find a way to actually sell your game. And if this game has like physical components like dice or trackers or anything, you have to figure out how to get those made and then figure out how to actually boss them up and ship them with your game. You're doing absolutely everything for it. So let's go over some pros here. The first is that this can be a profitable way to sell it. If your game costs $50 to buy, and it costs you $5 to make, and $5 to ship if you have free shipping, you made $40 in profit. The margins aren't normally that good when I price it out, but you can get a game with pretty good profit margins, and you can sell a good number of them. So you can make some really good money this way. Most people don't sell that many, but in theory it's possible. The second pro is you get complete control here, unlike using a publisher. You can choose what artists you want to use. You can use any material or ideas you want. Like, one of the other methods here will be print on demand, and in that method you're limited to whatever the print on demand company is willing to do. But not here. With full self-publishing, if you want goodies like stickers or bookmarks or something, you can do that. So this method definitely has the most freedom. But it does have some negatives as well. The first will be cost. One big issue with having stuff self-published is that the good prices are going to be bulk discounts. That's true if you're only doing a book, but it's also true if you're doing like dice or boards or other stuff as well. Like, I just looked at GameCrafter, which is a pretty popular self-publishing site to get all your supplies. And if you want to dip your toe into the water and buy 10 copies, you'll be at a 5% discount. But 100 copies is 35% off. And a lot of times that 35% still won't be huge profits. You'll really want to be ordering 500 or more copies at that 50% off. So you'll probably need to spend several $1,000s getting enough copies where they'll be sold at a profit. Obviously, this is way different based on if you're just doing a book or a whole board game setup, but it's something to be aware of. And this comes into your second negative. You really don't know how many to order. If you're running at a 50% margin and you order 500 copies and you sell 250 of them, well, now you're broke even with 250 copies just sitting in your closet. Which, if you can sell them in the future, that's awesome, you're making money. But from reading about game publishing on forums, I hear a lot of really sad, depressing stories about people who've printed their game, made hundreds of copies, and then not being able to sell them, and now they're just stuck away in a storage unit or something. Kind of like a pile of shame. So outside of the finance, the only other negative I want to talk about here is it's a very high level of effort. You not only have to create the game and do the graphic design and work with the artists and then try to find a way to actually sell it to people, but you also have to do 100% of the marketing. You have to manage distributions and sales. You have to track profit and stuff for your taxes. It's just everything you can think that you might have to do, you'll have to do here. The next method will be self-publishing, but specifically with crowdfunding. The big one here is Kickstarter, but there's a couple other platforms you can use. So how this works is basically the same as self-publishing, except for one major difference. And that's instead of paying for the development yourself, you're having other people pay for it up front to help create the game. People pre-order this, typically at a discount or with extra rewards. The major positive of this is that your game becomes pre-funded. You'll know how many sales you have before you get to the point where you have to spend a lot of money, so the budgeting is made easy in some regards. And you can generate hype for the game while you're building it, which is a nice benefit as well. And if people pay money to crowdfund it, they have a feeling that they helped you build the game, which is true in some sense. And these community members will help give you ideas and feedback that can be useful if you're being pretty public about the process. Another positive over using traditional publishers is you get your game funded, but you still maintain complete control. You can pick the artists, you can make the final decisions, all of that. So if you don't have the money to make the game, but you want to maintain control, it's a good option. It's kind of halfway in between. For example, one of my favorite games is Stars of Ikarios, and they use this method. So it can work really well, and you can end up with an absolutely fantastic product. The final positive is you can set a limit where your game actually gets funded or not. So this can kind of let you do some market testing. And the market always votes with their dollars, so if it gets funded, it at least seems like a good idea and there's potential there. And if it didn't get funded, then you can either make the decision to use another method, or try to figure out why no one was interested. This method does have a lot of negatives though. The first is the fees they take. They take roughly 5%, and then they have a processing fee of 3 to 5%. Because you are basically self-publishing, you have to pay for artists, designers, someone to make the actual materials, actually the print house you're using. So this can already have a pretty high cost, so taking another 10% out, and you might not have much left over. I spend a lot of time watching videos and reading game updates from designers, and it's very common to actually be losing money per copy in the early phases of your crowdfunding or your Kickstarter. So this is not only because of the fees, but typically you either give your early funders a discount or extra goodies for free. So you're hoping they can kind of help you with the initial development, even though you'll be losing a little bit, and then you'll be making your money after that. Not that the whole focus of this video is profit or anything, but most people making a game would at least like to break even and not be negative, so you have to kind of be aware of that. The hard part here is that a lot of your core buyers, like the people you love in the game, will have already bought in this early discounted phase. So while you do get the initial investment, you still don't know how many people will buy it after the Kickstarter is over. There's other ways to do this where you can price in a profit right off the bat, and once the Kickstarter's over, you're done making it, but that method isn't as common. Like, most people don't want their game just to be a limited run. One issue with Kickstarter is that it's not always about how good the execution or the idea is. A lot of it's about how well you market your campaign. So sometimes bad ideas get funded because they have amazing marketing, and amazing games never get made because they couldn't generate hype. If you are going to do this method, I highly recommend watching some videos or reading some articles on how to market your campaign before you start one, because that can really be a make or break point. The other negative of Kickstarter is sometimes it can get a bad rap. For example, people will promise amazing games, charge $200, and then they just don't deliver. Or it can take years to finish, or never actually happen. So if you are going to do a Kickstarter, please make sure you're the type of person who will actually follow through and deliver on your promise. People are giving you their money, and you want to make sure you deliver on that, and especially in a timely manner. If you aren't sure you can really work hard and deliver, then work as far as you can for free or for cheap, and then do the campaign to the finalized art and the manufacturing cost. That's how I personally think I would do it. I would basically have the base game already made, like at least like the free playtesting, and then do Kickstarter to actually get it made. So the final method I want to talk about here is what I'm personally doing, and that's a print to order or print on demand method. The one I'm using is DriveThruRPG and WargameVault, which are the same company, but there's a couple others out there. How this method works is you do all the work you do for self-publishing, but once you have the PDF file made up and formatted for printing, you go to one of these companies. And they have a website set up that's a print house, so you upload your name there, and then it's a marketplace where people can come and buy it through them. If they want to order a PDF, it gets emailed out and they collect payment and then give you your part of it. And if they want an actual physical printed copy, they use their printing services, print one right then and there and send it to them. The two main positives of this method go hand in hand, and that's there's no inventory and low startup costs. Because copies get made as people order them and sent directly from the printer, you don't have to buy anything up front. And you don't have to manage the logistics of getting them sent out. That's the main reason I did this. I have no clue if I'm going to sell 5 copies or 500, and I don't want a big pile sitting there that I didn't sell. Or on the flip side, I don't want to order not enough and not be able to fulfill orders. To be transparent, I was much more worried about ordering too many and not selling them, which not only wastes money but space. The other big positive of this method is you have some built-in marketing. Because these websites have collections of other games, people will go there and just browse. And while they're doing this, they might find yours. Because of this, you can get some free exposure and have people see your game without you spending any marketing money. So the first negative is that they do take a cut of each sale. It looks like the industry average is 30 to 40% of profit, so not the price of the game, but the profit after expenses are paid, like the printing costs. So it's completely personal if you think the help of the logistics and not keeping inventory is worth that much. Since I largely did this as a hobby project, I didn't want to deal with the logistics, so I decided it was personally. But if you think that's a ripoff and would rather do it yourself, that's totally reasonable. So the other major negative here is you are limited by what the company actually offers. For example, I had thought about making tokens or some little other extras with my game, but DriveThruRPG only offers a few things that I really didn't want to use. You can get creative here. Like, I have some printable PDFs going out free with the game where you can print them off, cut them out for different trackers and stuff, but it's not as high quality as if a publisher had actually made it, or if I had funding from Kickstarter with a higher price. So if you have a big grand vision, you'll want to make sure that the company you plan to handle your logistics can also make that happen. And it looks like most of them don't really offer all that much for extras, so you'll have to be careful there. Now you know what the game is you're trying to make, and you have an idea of what method you'd like to use. So it's time to actually start putting that game together. At this point, you should expect your game idea to be drastically different than the final product. Your idea as it stands right now without a single run of playtesting is probably pretty bad and broken in a lot of ways you're not even aware of. And that's okay. What we're going to do with that information is make our first playtest and play the game totally by ourselves. When making this prototype, you want to spend minimal time on it because after each of your first few solo playtests, you're going to make some pretty major changes, and you'll probably have to redo a lot of your prototyping like tokens and tools, so don't spend much time on them. It will probably look a lot like an elementary school project with cardboard cutouts and pieces and note cards everywhere. And a pro tip is to steal trackers and materials from other games or board games you have. Like, I used a lot of zombie-side pieces and kill team markers at this point, so stuff like that can work pretty well here. All we're trying to do is figure out some of the big overarching mechanics of the game, not really trying to balance anything. So instead of writing out all your stats or spells, just write 12 range, 2 hit kill, if that's going to be fairly average for what you had in mind. Keep your rules to bullet points and notes, nothing very detailed. Like, you could write out more details and it wouldn't hurt anything, you'll just be wasting a lot of time. And since things will be so different in the future, like, there's not really a point to it. The idea I originally had for my game is that you'd want to tactically move across the board to the objective, and that you'd be better off the faster you could pull that off. But to move fast or too far ahead of your team and you get ambushed and punished for it. But then once I start trying to actually do this solo playtesting, I realized that my original idea had zero motivation to move across the board. Like, you could just sit there and never push up and let the enemies come to you. There's no reason to ever move out of your starting position. This is the kind of stuff you'll figure out very quickly and that you don't really need playtesters for. So there's nothing saying you can't use playtesters at this point. The reason I didn't is I didn't want to bore them with a non-functional game. For example, that issue with my game is that once that issue gets solved, the game will play entirely differently. Like, some of the main rules will be completely changed. So until I go and make that change, I'd be kind of limited in what else I could learn from a playtest. So by playing solo, I can stop the game right there, rewrite that rule, and then restart. That'd be kind of annoying if you actually had playtesters, because they'd be playing for 10 minutes and then restarting. So I did about 5 short matches by myself, and then I played 2 all the way through until I knew the general concepts could work. So the cost for this step should be basically free, maybe $10 in arts and crafts supplies or printer paper. Like, mine looked pretty redneck, but I found some random stuff around the house and made it work. No reason to spend much money at this point. So now you have your core mechanisms basically worked out. The objective and the actions you do within the game should have a rough shape, so now's the time when you actually start assigning values and numbers to those. They can and will change a lot in the future, so initially you just have to kind of take your best guess. For special abilities or rules, you can just have a general idea of what they do. For example, instead of a paragraph of text, you could just say, shoot twice at -1 to hit on your note card, and that's fine. You don't have to worry about exact wording at this point. So you don't have to make everything for the entire game. If it's a 40k style game, maybe make a limited list for 2 factions. RPGs are hard to solo playtest, but you can maybe just make 2 classes only up to level 2, and then make 2 enemy types. You basically just want to start to get a feel for how the numbers will work out, and to make sure your game still works when you have actual numbers associated with it. You're also trying to make sure that your stats and numbers are in the rough ballpark of balance. That way, when you have friends or playtesters play it for the first time, it's at least semi-functional. So a funny story with this is when I was in this step, I wrote out about 5 Xenos and 4 classes. And I rolled to see what Xenos I'd face, and it was one that had an ability to heal itself at the end of the turn. So pretty basic. Well, I realized at one point, with its defense and healing ability, and the attack damage of the human players, they'd have to have multiple turns of every single person shooting at it and rolling perfectly, it missing every armor roll possible to ever kill one. So it was basically unkillable. And these were supposed to be a big horde type enemy. So that's an example of something that would have just been a miserable, unplayable experience for playtesters that I could catch on my own. So I guess one caveat here, sometimes people like to design games with a friend or a group of friends. If that's the case, you don't need to solo playtest this. But I designed this game solo, so I was just doing it all by myself at this point. So throughout this process, as you get the numbers dialed in, you can start making more detailed looking note cards and tokens. And you can start planning out how you'd playtest it with other people in the future. But I wouldn't worry about making any artwork or making anything look pretty at this point. So for this stage, the cost should be about the same as step 1. Maybe you've had some more stuff printed off, or you're getting more into ideas and doing some more craft supplies or buying an actual board to play on or some terrain. This is where I bought a couple miniatures that I thought would look nice. But this stuff can still be free to maybe upwards to $20. I wouldn't go over $100 because your ideas will still change, and there's other stuff involved that you'll want to spend money on. So now you have some basic stat lines for whatever style game you're making. You've done a fair number of solo playtests. So it's time to ask a pretty rough question. And that is the concept if your game is worth pursuing any further. So I have a personal philosophy of failing quickly. Meaning instead of worrying about finding the perfect product and sitting there and thinking through every possible detail, I'd rather spend a little bit of time coming up with a couple ideas that I think have merit, and then testing them pretty rapidly to see which thing actually works. Because of this, I had already rejected a couple ideas before I actually got to this step. But here's where I think you have enough data to know if it will actually work out or not. Basically, is the game going to be fun enough to push through true playtesting and writing out all the rules? So here I'd stop and really contemplate if you think your idea is worth pursuing at this point, because you have a lot of work ahead of you. And there's nothing wrong with just saying, okay, I think this has potential, but not right now. I'm going to work on something else. One disclaimer I want to give here is if you think it's not worth pursuing, don't think of that as giving up or failing. I personally kept all my notes from the games I stopped making, because in the future I might come up with something that could make those functional and continue those ideas. So it's not like you're trashing your idea, you're just moving on to something you think is better. Now that you know you're pursuing the idea, really get it to the point where other people can play it. This means that you know the game is functional and the stats and rules actually work. Probably not balanced particularly well, but they work. You don't need all your rules written out. Your wording doesn't have to be very specific and can be a little bit wonky. But get your players what they need on note cards or Word documents. Like, I made rudimentary character sheets at this point just on a Word document for each class. And I didn't have all my classes made, but it was enough to actually play the game. And it's okay if a lot of your rules are just verbally explained or on bullet points. Nothing needs to be pretty, just functional. Like, prioritize utility over everything else when getting this set up. And I guess this is where we need to talk about how to actually find playtesters. So I personally just use local friends through the whole process. I live in the town I grew up in, and most of the guys I know are nerdy enough to enjoy playtesting a wargame. But I know a lot of you won't be in that situation, so there's a few things you can do here. The first thing is that if you have friends who are willing to play, it can be done virtually. Like, this would work best for an RPG and not an actual miniature wargame, but there are options like Tabletop Simulator, which I've never been a huge fan of using that myself, but it would be a good tool here. The next best options are strangers to playtest it. The easiest way to do this would be at a local gaming store. So mine shut down about 2 weeks into me making this game, so I never actually got to use that method because the closest store was a little over an hour away. But if you talk to a store owner, they can probably set up a demo night and ask some of the regular customers to come in and help you. Or if they have something like a Discord community or Facebook group, you could go on there and ask for people to help you as well. Another place I'd probably look is something like a local gaming group or even a college that has a club for games like this. They might be able to help you get a small group together to test this out. Like I said, I don't have a lot of experience actually using strangers to play tests because the closest gaming store is like an hour away. They have kind of weird hours and they don't honestly have the friendliest staff. So I do understand if you struggle with this step. For being a social hobby, finding other people to be social with can kind of be the hardest part. So now we get to do what we've been aiming for the whole time, and that's get people to actually play our game. So rule number 1 of playtesting is take notes. These notes can be as simple as fighter HP is too high, reduced to 4 from 5, to something more broad like movement stage is taking too long, simplify the way dashes and measurements work. So I purposely waited 1 to 2 weeks between playtesting sets so I could implement any changes I wanted to make and then try again. When you do this, make sure to very clearly write what was different between your playtesting sessions so your playtesters know what to expect. Since I use the same group over and over, I'd actually send them Discord messages saying next time we play I added a new ability that does XYZ and changed this ability to do 1, 2, 3. So they could basically get a patch note and not be as confused when we start playing something was different. And it actually saves time when we start playtesting because everybody would know what the new changes were, so you didn't have to catch everybody up to speed. So there's a few rules for how to handle your playtesters. Number 1 is try to make sure it's fun for them. I know that sounds obvious, but they aren't there to work. They're there to play a game, are willing to embrace any kind of jankness it has. So don't debate them on measuring distances or get into an argument if they don't like one of your rules. Normally, I just write down the complaint and then think about it later. So another major tip is watch your players and see if they're having fun. Early on in the playtesting, I noticed that after a certain point in the round, they just do moves on autopilot and didn't really rush. So that told me that rounds either went way too long or there was nothing creating urgency past a certain point. So I made a rule that would punish them if they took too long, and would encourage them to do risky plays at the midpoint of the round to try to get the round over with instead of just being on autopilot. Like, none of the playtesters said they were bored, but I could see that they were looking at their phones, that they'd stop paying attention, that they'd start talking about something else. They weren't as highly engaged as they were before. So after a few times of playtesting and adjusting, I tuned it so they were engaged the entire time. I never told them that's what I was looking for, it's just something to take note of. So another playtesting tip is you should highly, highly value their advice, but you don't have to do it. So my friend Ethan probably had the most creative input into the game of anybody I talked to. Basically every part of the game, he had quite a few ideas for me. And most of his ideas either inspired something in the game or ended up directly in the final product, but not all of them. There weren't many ideas he had that I didn't like the concept of, but there were a few that when I went to add it in, I just couldn't quite make it work mechanically. Like, one was a character that was going to be able to absorb an alien's DNA, either in a wave or at the end of it, and then gain an upgrade based on that. I tried to write rules for it, but it ended up being really complicated. I had to write out upgrades for every Xenos and make them interesting, and then try to get it to balance with everything else in a way that wasn't confusing. It was a really cool idea, I just couldn't find a way to actually implement it. One thing that was really common were playtesters would realize they didn't like something, and maybe even suggest a change, but they aren't always great at knowing why they didn't like something. So sometimes you'll have to take a suggestion and realize the issue isn't actually what they're complaining about, but it's something else kind of connected to that that's broken or less optimal. This happened to me pretty frequently, where they would complain about something and I would find another better solution that would make that issue go away. All that to say, take any suggestions seriously, but just because someone tells you to do something doesn't mean it's always the right thing for your game. Or there might not be a right and wrong, it's just a preference, and at the end of the day, it's your game. Do what you think is best for it. So I did about 10 games of playtesting this way, which my game is structured as waves, like a survival video game, so it ended up being like playing through 40 waves. Basically continue this process until you have confusing rules worked out, you don't have any pacing issues, and all of your classes and factions have been tested and stats sorted out. Like, you'll probably find a lot of contradicting rules along the way, and that's the kind of stuff you're looking for. As you get towards the end of this process and start putting rules onto paper, use the wording you actually want in your rulebook. That way, if there's any kind of weird wording that makes weird loopholes, you can find those here. For a lot of casual games, that's not as big of an issue, but for something like Warhammer, that comes up a lot. So the cost at this point still won't be high. While you'll want some more polish on your materials, I use Canva to make drafts and charts and character sheets, which is totally free. And I did buy some miniatures to use, but those weren't very expensive either. I think I ended up spending like $40 on them, and about $20 on playtesting supplies. Like, the only thing that should really be pricey at this point is, if you have people playtesting, buy them pizza and beer, and that should be about it. A topic that goes with playtesting that I wanted to address separately is game balance. This is one of the big factors you'll be working through on your playtesting. But if you're a hobbyist, it will be hard to get this perfect. For a game like mine, there are hundreds of combinations of events that can happen, and you can't test all of them. And if you're playing with repeated playtesters, player skill can be a major factor here. If your best player tends to like magic classes in your fantasy game, it might look like magic is overpowered just because they're playing optimally, while your fighter isn't being smart with their plays. So if you think this might happen, you can one-on-one tell the better player to try out different playstyles or classes so you can test it out. If you're in playtesting, they should be pretty understanding of this, or you can just assign classes or tell your players you want them to really focus on a certain type of build or strategy so you can test it properly. When playtesting specifically for balance, you can cheese the rules a little bit. Since my game was a roguelite, there'd be times where a certain Xenos or item just wouldn't show up and I wanted to balance test. So every once in a while, I knew ahead of time what I wanted to show up later in the game, and I just tell my players ahead of time I was going to pick out a specific enemy instead of it being random, just to try it out. So there's another topic I wanted to cover in this balance session, and that's that there will never be perfect balance, so you have to choose the level you're okay with. I feel like a lot of people basically say that if you can't get it perfect, then don't bother, but I don't think that's the case at all. For an extreme case, D&D is super unbalanced. A meta build against a casual one is not even close in power, but because D&D isn't a super competitive tactical game, it can still be amazing. But to counterpoint, you do have to have the right group that's all on the same page. I think D&D would be a better game if it was more balanced, but because the entire point of that game is being creative and never having the same experience twice, it may have taken them an insane amount of time to get the game slightly more balanced. And even though there are endless videos online of broken builds and exploits, it's still a great game, people love it. But there are games you can think of that aren't balanced well and it ruins the experience. They're an awesome concept, but because the balance is horrible, it makes the game just not fun to play. To avoid bad-mouthing any particular tabletop games, I'll use League of Legends as an example. Because that game is so competitive, it's player first player, it's a team game, and it has snowballing effects, a small issue in balance can ruin the experience. All that to say, when you're at the point where your core rules are worked out and you're making balancing adjustments, you just need to decide ahead of time how precise your balance needs to be. If it's a serious competitive game, you might need to slow down and really tune it in. If it's a much more casual experience, and it's more heavily based on creativity, well, your time might be better spent focusing on the fun factor and rules clarity, and you can afford to not have absolutely perfect balance. A good way to kind of gauge this is, are your playtesters having fun regardless of the fact that it's not perfect? Or is it enough of an issue where it's affecting the game and causing things to not be fun or feel unfair? In that case, you need to work on it a little longer. So I promise we're going to get into the more technical aspects here soon. So now you basically have a functional, fun-to-play game. You just need to get it in an actual rules format. This is where you write out your rules, like with the exact wording. I'd still do this on a Word document or equivalent and not a design software, just because something like Microsoft Word is going to be a lot easier to write in and it's easier to edit. So this is where you get your specific wording and your game terms nailed down. This is that nerdy technical wording we all love to abuse as nerds and find loopholes in. Think about in Magic the Gathering or something like Kill Team. If something isn't phrased a particular way, it can be a major buff or nerf and can heavily affect how things synergize with each other. Like if you have a wording of one thing triggers before something else, or it's up to the player, that seems minor, but it can make a major difference. Once you have all that wrote out, I would continue playtesting. These playtests will likely not have major game design changes, but it's getting those small details worked out. The difference between good and great is all the detail work you put in here. Like before this step, you probably have a pretty solid game. It's just taking it to that next level. And since we're getting close to actually formatting your game for publishing, this is a great time to start working through the lore and the so-called fluff details, and getting those written out exactly how you want them in the final product. So once again, no cost here except paper and buying food and drinks for the playtesters. So one thing here is if you're using an actual game publisher and you're not self-publishing or doing any of the other methods, this is where you probably stop and you actually go and try to pitch it to them. So I don't have any first-hand experience, so take everything I say here with a grain of salt, but try to figure out which publisher makes games like yours and figure out if they have a submission process. If not, then send a very professional email asking if they take submissions and how that process works. Another awesome way to do this is go to actual gaming conventions where these publishers are. You get the list of who will be there and ask beforehand if you could have a 15-minute meeting with them and actually talk about your idea. Also, from my understanding, don't worry about them stealing your idea. If it's not clear from above, ideas are easy, executions and details are the hard part, and they can't really steal that from you. Like, from my understanding, if you immediately start talking about like an NDA agreement or some kind of contract so they can't steal your game idea, they won't even talk to you. So I wouldn't worry about that. Try to pitch it. If it's that good of an idea, they'll probably want to work with you anyways. Okay, so now let's get on to the actual technical stuff. From earlier in this video, you should have picked a method you're using to publish if you aren't using a publisher, or if you couldn't get a publisher deal and decided to self-publish in some method. Well, here you need to pick exactly what you're doing. The reason is that the following steps will be formatting your book, and you have to follow the printer's guidelines for your actual formatting. If you're doing digital PDF only, this isn't really a point you need to worry about too much. So if you use Kickstarter, or at some point you're going to self-publish, you have to find a printer company that can make your book to the criteria you want. Like, I personally knew I wanted to make my book all black and white, no color. Or if you want full color, you have to make sure they can do that. And then you have to think about hardback, paperback, the actual physical size, like I think mine's 8x10. All of that kind of stuff. To be honest, I'm not incredibly artsy, so I found a company I wanted to use, which was the DriveThruRPG program, and then I just picked from their list. But if you have a very clear idea of what you want, you'll have to find somewhere that can actually accommodate that. So I would say if you're doing full self-publishing, like you're actually going to buy a giant pile of books, I would make sure whoever you talk to that they're easy to talk to and that they're helpful, because you'll likely have formatting questions if you're new like I was, and that can be kind of hard to do if you don't have some kind of resource. So this part is very important before you actually start laying anything out. Once you have your printer picked out, figure out what their guidelines are for their documents, like what programs they actually work with, like as far as software programs. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. I don't even know what all of these settings mean, but these are the specs for how the printer company works, and it will only look right if you follow these guidelines. And also figure out if they have a specific program like InDesign that they want you to use. So let's talk about some of those different programs here. Just in case they do let you use several, I'll go over kind of the basics of each one. So most printers actually just want a PDF that you're going to use. And you can also send this PDF out to people digitally if they only want a digital copy. But there's a couple different softwares you can use that will actually allow you to make these. So the one I used was Affinity Publisher. The reason was that it was basically the mid-tier program, and it was a one-time purchase of $70 instead of a subscription model. So I wanted to have the program for future projects, but I thought it might be a year or two before I get to those, and I didn't want to pay for a subscription the entire time. So Affinity Publisher has a lot of user guides online and great tutorial videos. Once you get going, it was fairly easy to use, but you can tell it's made for professionals and it's not the best UI. Because it's not as popular as the competitors, you won't find quite as many Reddit threads or forums where people have answered questions, but for simple stuff you can normally figure it out. If you are really good at art design and want to use a lot of photos and colors, you can add another program to help you, called Affinity Photo. I didn't personally use it, but I know it's there. It's basically like their Photoshop. So the most popular program that people use is Adobe Indesign. This is the Adobe Creative Suite, so if you have that for Photoshop, you actually already have this program, in which case it's a no-brainer, I would use it. But it is pretty expensive. It's $23 a month just for this program, or if you want the whole Creative Cloud, it's going to be starting at $35 a month, but go up to $59. But that does get you Photoshop and some other programs that can actually help you with your design. So Adobe InDesign is probably the most powerful of the softwares, and it does integrate with Photoshop. So if you already know how to use that, that's a major advantage for adding in artwork and doing some small edits. And InDesign will have the most forum and online questions asked. So if you need references on how to do something, it will have that information. It's basically the industry standard as far as I can tell. But like I said, it does have the highest pricing, and there's no way to buy it without the subscription, which that was the biggest negative for me. The final option here is Scribus. It's an open source program, which means it's totally free, and it has a pretty big community out there. But that also means it's the least polished. So I originally started with Scribus and found the UI to be pretty rough for a total beginner. Like, I thought Publisher was a lot easier to jump into personally, but someone might totally disagree with me on that. That's just my personal experience. So a warning here is DriveThruRPG removes Scribus as one of the programs they recommend, but it used to be on there, so that's why I bring it up, because it was on there and it's free. I think they just had enough issues with it that they didn't want people using it. Like, I did read on multiple forums where people sent off their PDFs to the printer, and it had some kind of issue in the background that was really hard to figure out. And I know a lot of people did find solutions to these different problems when using Scribus, and a lot of people had great success with it, saved a lot of money. So it is an option if you're on a really tight budget, but I recommend probably using something else. So for cost here, it's somewhere between free and several $100s for a couple months. So I'm going to average it out and say you'll be paying roughly $100 for a software. So now let's talk about actually using your design software. If you're new, I do a follow-along YouTube video to get the basics of the program down. They'll probably have you make your brochure for an ice cream shop or something dumb, but it will teach you how to use it. Do that a few times, and then you won't be totally lost when you start. Since people watching this will be using different softwares, I can't really go into the details of how to use it, and that would be its own hour-long video anyways. So after you do those follow-alongs and learn basically how to use it, there's a couple things you can do here that will save you a lot of heartache later on. Go into your Word file and move tests around onto a 2-page spread, and even make like blank bosses that say picture of alien B or picture of this item, and get it laid out just how you would want it to be on your actual software. Moving stuff around in the design program isn't as easy as on Word, so the closer you can get to your final layout, the better. This will allow you to focus on actually just the technical aspects of using the software and making everything look good, and not trying to figure it out as you go. at least as far as the layout goes. Another thing to do before you really dive into it is get the requirements for whatever printer you're using, and make sure you set up your document like that when you first open it up. Like most of your options you need later on, you can go ahead and set those up now. Like for example, every printer will have different bleed requirements, which is just the area on the outside of the page where the paper will actually get cut at. And you want your design to go into this area, but nothing that actually matters. There's also things like color profiles and some other settings that I don't entirely understand. You just want to make sure you follow whatever the recommendations are. You don't really need to know what they mean. This is also where you set up page size, so you'll want to make sure you get that right, otherwise you'll be trying to reshape everything later on. Like one thing I personally got stuck on when doing it for the DriveThruRPG site was figuring out if the first page was on the left or right side, and it's on its own on the right side, by the way. Stuff like that are issues that following these guidelines can really help prevent, so you're not trying to figure it out later. A lot of these settings don't really matter if you're only doing digital copies, but there are still guidelines for it, and you'll want to make sure you follow those. So now let's talk about how you'll actually want to lay out your book. So probably the biggest part here is you'll want to make sure that your order of information makes logical sense. Like, I found this really difficult, to be honest. I never really struggled to write out the rules, but finding the right order was difficult, because there's almost no way you can write something where you don't need to know something that's later in the book, and you don't want your reader flipping around. I asked a couple friends about the order towards the end of my production, and every single one of them gave me different recommendations on what made sense to them. So I think this is one of those topics where there isn't a right answer, just more and less optimal. Like a big piece of advice for that is when you're getting your document together, really focus on your table of contents. This is where you can make sure the order really flows and makes sense. Like this is where you can make sure it makes sense to explain the lore first, kind of set the stage for the game. And then some basic overarching mechanics and the terms they need. And then the player session, then wrap up with the DM session. Or whatever the scenario is that makes sense for the game you're designing. It's easy to plan that out ahead of time than trying to guesstimate it while you go. So I started off by winging it, and the order of the rules made no sense. But then I decided to do outline first, and I could actually see the flow of the game, and that helped a lot. So for the visual layout, I personally try to keep the rules part fairly simple and easy to read. The publisher had a recommendation font size, so I used that for the main body. I think it was mostly around a 13 font, but your font style will affect it. I'd use 13 on Arial or Times New Roman, and see what the equivalent is for your font style. You'll also want to make sure that your main body font is easy to read. If you find one you like, you can Google if it's good for a main body of text, and kind of get a reality check, because if people are telling you not to use it, you probably want to listen to them. So when it comes to font colors, you can play around with it, but if it's more than about a paragraph, you really just want white background, black text. Like I have a point where it's a black background with white lettering, but that's only for very short sessions or lore parts where they don't have to read it over and over. Or if you have something like a graphic and you just want the color scheme to be a little more interesting just for that visual interest, you can do that there. So from what I've read for most like graphic designers, you want something visually interesting every 4 pages or so, and I tried to follow that. I'll put a couple examples of things I did to break up the design, just to keep it from looking like a Word document so you can get some ideas. I wanted someone to flip through the book and it look interesting without reading anything. Like a game that does this really well is the Alien RPG. It looks like it would be interesting just to flip through and read, even if you're not playing the game. Like D&D, Pathfinder, and 40K are all really good about this too, with having artwork and different layouts woven throughout the book. Like you can flip through some game books you have and see which ones you kind of like the vibe of, and use that as a general template, or at least a starting point. This whole topic is pretty artsy though, so there's not a right and wrong, it's personal preference. It's just something you need to think through before you actually get started. One thing that will help make your game book easier to navigate is having graphs and charts. A lot of programs aren't great at doing this in your actual software, so a lot of people will make them somewhere else and simply add them in from a different program. I personally use Canva for mine. But honestly, if you want to make them on Word or Excel or whatever, that'd be fine too. So I haven't used the other design softwares. Most of them will have a way to do this. It's just a matter of how easy or hard is it to actually use. If you don't know what Canva is, it's basically a free graphic design tool. You can go in and add whatever size of document you want. For drafts, I normally just set Instagram post to make it a square, and then you can add in pictures, elements, text, whatever you want. I use this for all my graphics in-game, and I also used it for my YouTube thumbnails, so it's very intuitive to use. Like, I had no prior experience for anything like that. Then you can save this and upload it into your design program as a picture, so it's just a nice free tool that's very easy to use. The other big part of your layout will be your artwork. There's not a hard and fast rule on how many pieces of art you have, but I try to do something like a piece for every 5 to 6 pages. I did use some more than once, and it's not that evenly spread out. But a good way to figure it out is if you find a book that has the amount you think looks right for your idea, count how much art they have, and then look at the page count, and try to replicate that ratio. That's one benefit of having a really good outline and having made your game in another Word document program before. You know how many pages you have, so you can really think about how much artwork you actually need. There's a couple different ways how to actually get this artwork. If you're an amazing artist and want to do it yourself, that's awesome, and that's definitely the easiest way to do it. And it's cool that you did your own art. So I am not an artist by any measure. But I have a friend that's great at that Lovecraftian Dead Space style of art, so I asked him if he would make it for me. And he's pretty into wargaming and nerdy stuff like this, so I could go back and forth with him on ideas, and he really did a lot of the creative for it. The other way will be pay a stranger to do it for you. So now I'm not speaking from experience because I didn't use a stranger, but here's how I would think through it. You'll want to give them an idea of what you want your artwork to look like, and you need to know if it's black and white or color, and you'll need to find someone that can do it digitally. So I would try to find an artist either online or somewhere like a local art program that had previous work that's the style you want. If you want something really realistic and they do mostly abstract, that probably won't work. So a good site for something like this is Fiverr, because the artist will have some samples of pieces you can look at to know kind of what work they've done before. From there, you'll want to have a list of what you want drawn and descriptions. For me, since I was working with a friend, I sent him over a list of all the alien species and all their gameplay abilities, and let him have a lot of freedom on what to do. So he did a demo drawing, and I really liked it, so he kept that style, and just carried it over to all the different species. So I'd initially ask for one demo piece, so you can make sure you're kind of on the same page, and that you like what they did before you really commit to it. Like, you'd hate to pay them to do 20 pieces, and then you don't like them. So how many you have them do will be limited by 2 things. One is how many pieces you want in your book, like we've talked about before, but also budget. Art's not cheap in most cases. It can range wildly, but for black and white, fairly simple pictures, it will be somewhere between $10 and $30 a piece. At least from what I've seen online. So I'll be transparent and say I spent roughly $10 a piece on mine, which, like I said, it was a friend who's not a professional. He's never done artwork for money before in his life. He just draws for fun. He's never made money at it, and he offered to do it for free, but I just wanted to pay him something for it. And then I'm just going to bully him into buying more 40k stuff with the money anyway, so it kind of works out. So the final thing here is when you pick an artist, you should try to figure out what their limits are. Like my friend Darren I had draw my artwork can't really draw people and faces as well, so we stayed with only having art for the aliens and not the characters or equipment. In some cases, you may want to use 2 artists who have a similar style, but one can do characters and the other can do background or equipment or whatever. So it's really hard to guess the cost here, because some of you will have 20-page rulebooks, some of you will have over 100. If you want to go fairly minimal, I'd say a few $100s for artwork. If you want to go all out and have art for absolutely everything, probably closer to 1,000 or more. So I got lucky here, and I'm not sure how much I would have been willing to spend otherwise, especially since it was kind of like a fun hobby thing. A lot of this comes down to personal finances too. I know for artwork, Kickstarter has a major advantage here over the other styles, because you kind of have your budget planned out based on how many people backed you. But I'd say estimate a few hundred. One topic I want to cover very quickly is freelance design. This is where instead of going through this whole process, you have your rules on Word, and then you pay someone to do all the layout work for you. I think this is actually fairly common, and it does save you from having to learn the program. You can get someone that's way better at using it and better at design than you are, and you don't have to buy the program in the first place. But there are some negatives to this. Like, just from a very quick Google search, it seems like it would cost somewhere around $1,000. Which sounds really, really high. But like I said, that's just from one search. I haven't done this personally. Maybe on Fiverr, you can knock that down to a couple hundred. If you're doing this, make sure your outline and all of your wording are exactly how you want it to be. Like, you'll want it to be the final, ready-to-go copy. You don't want to have to go back and forth with them to make changes, because that would probably just rack up prices higher and higher. You'll also want to get them all the formatting information for your printer to make sure they know exactly how to format everything. You don't want to pay someone to design everything, then it be where you can't use it. And like I was saying earlier with the wording, the chances are the person that's designing like your book isn't a wargamer. They maybe have played D&D, and that's probably about it. But even then, most likely not. So you really might have to walk them through the process. So I haven't used a freelance designer. Those are just some of the pieces of advice I saw when I looked into it, and what I think I'd personally do. So the final thing to design is making your cover. You'll definitely need this if you're doing a physical book, and even if you aren't doing a physical book, you still need it most of the time kind of for that online marketing. Like, so just a cover of a book to show, to kind of advertise it. Like with the layout portion, what I do is I look at a ton of other books and find something you like that has the general vibe you're going for. I don't remember exactly what it was, but when I was looking at artwork for mine, I found one of those game concept art books, and it was all black with some white text and a single piece of artwork. I thought this layout fit really well, and I used it as a general template. So that wasn't even a miniatures game. I just saw something that I thought was a cool style and used it for inspiration. If you get really stuck, I would just go to a bookstore like Barnes & Noble's and walk around the sci-fi or fantasy section until you find something that kind of inspires an idea. As far as the technical side of the cover, most publishers will have some kind of template you want to follow. Since I did the whole DriveThruRPG thing, I'll show theirs. It's important that when you get the template file, you make sure you input the correct size of the book and the number of pages. Like for the one I used, you have to leave a page blank, like at the very end of the book, and the page count has to be divisible by a certain number of pages, like 4, so you'll have to factor those in. The reason the page count matters is the program will automatically adjust the spine to be the right thickness for how many pages you have. I did 104 pages, and it looks like this. Like with the book layout, just make sure to reread the export options over and over, and really double check that everything matches up with those. Now let's talk about the marketing. The reason I'm putting this here is you should be planning this out before you actually publish your book. So there's a million ways to do this, but here's my very basic overview of some of the more popular ones. The first is the main way I plan on marketing, and that's social media. Primarily focused on YouTube. Like, this video here has made you very aware that I have a miniatures name out, and if I just put the URL in my other videos and they do decent, people may see that link and be interested enough to buy it. If you already have a YouTube channel like I did when you start making a game, great. But making a game is basically a full-time hobby, and so is YouTube. I'll be honest that my YouTube channel suffered to make this game, and there were a lot of points where I was nearing that burnout point trying to do both with a full-time job. With YouTube or any other social media, it has to be an audience that will actually care. And it can take a year or so to build up that audience. Like, I just wanted to do YouTube, then a few months later decided that making a game would be fun, so that kind of worked out. It's great because you have a built-in audience, and it's free to tell them about it. And through multiple posts or videos, you can tell them about it multiple times. But the negative is the amount of work it takes to get to the point might be as much as making the game in the first place. Probably more. The next marketing idea is paid ads. There's a lot of ways to handle this, but the main thing to consider is making sure that your cost doesn't outweigh your profit. If you're spending $10 for a sale, and you make $9 per copy, then you're ramping up sales to lose $1 per copy. Like, you're accelerating how fast you're losing money. So if you go hard on this and get 1,000 sales, you just lost $1,000. There's arguments about exposure and stuff, but I can't really see this working out for you because it's such a niche market. Typically, something like Google Ads will cost $1 to $2 per click, and not every click is a purchase. Like, sometimes conversion rates are in the single-digit percentiles. If you have your own website and decent margin, it might work. But if you have a game through something like DriveThruRPG, I really don't see this being profitable. but you could still just throw some money at it as a test to see how it works out. The last method I want to talk about is influencer marketing. This is where you strike up a deal with a social media influencer to sell your product. So I think most of my sales will be people who watch my videos. Well, the plan here is you get to spread the word of your game over a bunch of channels, not just your own. Some influencers will do this for free if you send them a product. Some may want money up front, and some will want a royalty per sale that they get if you have a way to track that. If I was really caring about making money with this, that's what I would have focused on personally. If the game does decent, I might do this later on, since there's no rule against doing more marketing after the game's been out for a while. So I do want to make a disclaimer here about everything I said. My game isn't out as I'm making this video, so I might get like 0 sales and I have no expertise here, and you shouldn't listen to me. I'm just telling you how I thought about each topic when I was thinking through options. Regardless, you want some way to tell people about your game, even if you're just doing it on Reddit posts or different forums you're involved in. Like, you want to get the word out somehow. So now you have all your game mechanics worked out, you have your book design full of useful tools and drafts, and you're almost ready to publish. At this point, you're just going to double and triple check everything yourself. You want to get it basically perfect. Really take it one paragraph at a time, and read everything, even the little flavor test lore bits. I'd also highly recommend having 2 or 3 other people read through it after you do, just trying to find more issues. There's a few points where I accidentally hit a letter when I was doing my final proofreading, and my friends caught it. Make sure to tell your proofreaders to point out every little grammar or spelling or logic mistake here. If you have a book that's over about 50 pages, it's going to be really hard to catch all of them, but you want to minimize it as much as possible. I don't think I have a single other rule book without some kind of spelling mistake in it or grammar mistake. But you're almost to the end of the process, so don't get lazy here. Like, make that final push. The last part of this process is you're now ready to publish your game. This is where you'll export your files as PDF, once again making sure everything is to your publisher specifications, and get your game going. If you're doing a self-publishing method, this is where the real dollars get spent. So I don't have a hack to tell you how much you'll want to order, but you'll be buying everything up front and then recouping money as you sell copies. Then if you sell out or get close to selling out, you'll likely buy more. If it costs you $10 a copy and you want 100 copies to start with, you'll be spending about $1,000. If it's Kickstarter, you'll be spending a lot of your raised money at this point to order copies. Most of the time Kickstarter has a little add-on, so that will increase price too. So if you sold 100 copies, it might be closer to $2,000 or $3,000 for you, so hopefully you've raised that much. Or if you're doing print to order like I am, you'll want to order a proof copy, which mine was like $4 or $5 with $4 or $5 shipping, so it was about $10. And if you messed up the first one like I did, you'll have to order it twice, so it will be $20. Actually, a proof copy is something you'll do in all of these cases. It's just a demo copy. So you'll order one at your cost, and you'll look it over to make sure everything looks good to go. Once it's to you and you give it a really good look over and it all looks great, then you can tell the printer that it's good to go and to make your game live, or you can order all the bulk copies yourself. The reason you want this proof is in case something happened, like you accidentally did a setting wrong and your colors look really wonky. Or if something was shifted over and you realize that on one of your pages everything's like half an inch to the left and there's like a white bar there. Something like that. At this point you've done it. Your game is live and people get to enjoy it. So I'm writing this part of the script while my game is sent to the publisher phase. So I haven't done any of the post-launch stuff. But you can continue marketing if you care about making more money from it. Like if that was the actual goal. Or if it was just for fun, then you can do however much marketing you care about. And then just enjoy playing it. For supporting the game, I'm personally not doing any add-ons or DLC. At least I'm not planning to. But it's something you can think about and see if anyone's asking for it. Or if there's any requests for tools or trackers, you can make those and send them out for free. Like, I have a couple ideas for trackers that I think might be useful, or something like extra cards for players. So if people want those, I'll probably make those later on and send them out kind of as a free thank you. If you want to check out my game, I'll have the link in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and if you're making a game, good luck. If you do make it following some of this advice, please let me know what it is. I'd love to check it out. Thank you for watching.